August 24, 1814. Washington, D.C., the young capital of a fledgling nation, stood on the brink of disaster. Smoke curled into the sky, carried by the wind across the quiet streets, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning timber. Yet, at this moment, no one in the city truly understood the scale of what was about to unfold. The most powerful army on earth was marching not towards the battlefield of Europe, but into the heart of the United States. 4,000 battle-hardened British veterans, fresh from the wars that had toppled Napoleon himself, were advancing under command of Major General Robert Ross, an Irishman whose name, today, has faded almost entirely from memory. Against them stood roughly 7,000 American militia and regular soldiers, ill-prepared, poorly trained, and, in many cases, profoundly untested in the horrors of real warfare. On paper, the Americans had the numbers. In reality, they were about to learn just how hollow such numbers could be. Ross was no ordinary general. He had fought in some of the bloodiest campaigns in Europe, witnessing the chaos and carnage of the Napoleonic Wars. He had seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the devastating power of discipline and strategy. And now, he was on a mission that few could have imagined possible, to march his men 40 miles behind enemy lines, strike decisively, and capture the capital of a nation that had never faced an army like his before. The streets of Washington, for all their elegance and civic pride, were vulnerable. Government buildings, constructed with fragile materials and little thought for defense, stood like paper fortresses in the shadow of the approaching storm. The city's defenders were nervous, disorganized, and in some cases, outright terrified. Rumors had spread of the British Army's ruthless reputation, of their victories across Europe, and of the horrors they could unleash. Yet even fear could not prepare them for what was coming. This is where the story begins, not with the roar of cannon or the clash of sabers, but with a man whose determination and experience would change the course of a day, if not history itself. Major General Robert Ross, walking among his officers, was calm, measured, and supremely confident. His sharp green eyes scanned the maps, his mind already calculating every possible move. He understood the weaknesses of the American position, the inexperience of the troops, and the chaos that panic could bring, and he planned to use all of it. Behind him, the soldiers of the British Army moved like a well-oiled machine. Drums rolled, flags flapped in the breeze, and the steady rhythm of marching boots echoed across the fields. These were men who had seen Europe burn under Napoleon's campaigns, men who had endured hardship, hunger, and endless skirmishes. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to accomplish a mission, and to accomplish it swiftly. Meanwhile, the American side was a picture of confusion. Local militias had been hastily assembled, volunteers called up with little training or equipment. Some were farmers, others shopkeepers, men who had little notion of military discipline. Regular army units tried to organize defensive lines, but communication was poor and leadership fragmented. In some quarters, panic had already begun to set in, whispers of retreat fluttering through the ranks like contagious disease. The contrast could not have been starker. On one side, experience, discipline, and precision. On the other, courage, yes, but also fear, chaos, and uncertainty. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave a mark on the nation, not only because of the destruction it would bring, but because of the lesson it would teach about preparation, leadership, and the merciless calculus of war. And yet, there is something almost surreal about this day. In the calm before the storm, the city of Washington seemed almost unaware of the historical moment it was about to witness. Children played in the streets. Merchants swept their doorsteps. Birds sang in the trees. History, as so often happens, crept up silently, unnoticed, until the ground trembled beneath the weight of thousands of marching soldiers. Russ's plan was audacious. 40 miles behind enemy lines, cut off from reinforcements, operating with a force smaller than his enemy, he intended to achieve something that many thought impossible. He was betting not on luck, not on chance, but on strategy, discipline, and the unflinching courage of his men. And for this reason, the story of that day is not just a story of victory, but of audacity, of brilliance, and of the strange, often cruel irony of history. By the end of this day, the name Robert Ross will be associated with the capture of a capital, the burning of its most symbolic buildings, and a victory so complete it seemed almost too perfect. And yet, despite the scale of his achievement, Despite the precision and success of his campaign, he would not live to see the lasting fame that other military geniuses of his era enjoyed. His victory would be celebrated briefly, written about in dispatches, but then largely forgotten, overshadowed by other events and other names. But on that morning, as the sun rose over Washington, as smoke began to curl over distant treetops, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the march, the approach, and the inevitable collision between two very different armies, led by two very different kinds of men. This is the story of that collision. This is a story of audacity, terror, and triumph. And this is where we begin, at the moment when history crept quietly over the horizon, and the world's most powerful army prepared to enter the capital of a young, defiant nation. As the morning mist lifted over the rolling fields of Maryland, the stage for one of the most extraordinary and least remembered encounters in American history was quietly set. On one side, Major General Robert Ross, the Irishman whose reputation had been forged in the fires of the Napoleonic Wars, were preparing his men with meticulous care. On the other, the defenders of the young American capital were scrambling to organize a response that would prove tragically insufficient. Ross was not a man given to theatrics. His leadership was precise, almost surgical, informed by years of hard-won experience. He understood the psychology of battle, the weakness that fear and indecision could impose upon an untested army. His officers moved like clockwork around him, each step coordinated, each decision deliberate. To them, the task ahead was monumental, but it was achievable because Ross had prepared every detail with exacting precision. Maps were unfurled, orders whispered, and contingencies planned with the kind of discipline that had seen him through some of Europe's most desperate campaigns. The British soldiers under his command were veterans in the truest sense of the word. Men who had fought across continents, marched through mud and snow, survived artillery barrages, and watched their comrades fall by the thousands. Their boots were worn, their uniforms frayed, but their resolve was ironclad. Each man understood the stakes, not just for himself, but for his nation, and for the general who commanded him with calm authority. Theirs was a confidence born of experience, a trust in leadership that would be tested in ways few could predict. On the other side, the American forces presented a far different picture. Washington's defenders were a patchwork assembly of militia, volunteers, and a few regular army units. Some had been called up mere weeks before, others only days. Many had never fired a musket in anger, and even those who had were poorly equipped and largely untrained in the disciplined formations that the British had mastered. Leadership was fractured, with multiple commanders attempting to coordinate a defense that was, in reality, uncoordinated and chaotic. Yet amidst the uncertainty, certain figures stood out. Commodore Joshua Barney, a naval officer of considerable skill and determination, had taken charge of a small contingent of sailors and marines. He understood that their role would not be to hold the line indefinitely, but to delay the enemy, to inflict as much damage as possible before the inevitable collapse of the American positions. His men drilled under his watchful eye, practicing maneuvers and preparing for a desperate fight that none could predict would last more than a few hours. The contrast between Ross and the American commanders could not have been more striking. Ross moved with quiet authority, his calm presence instilling confidence in men who had already seen too much of war. The American officers, by contrast, were consumed by anxiety, issuing conflicting orders, arguing over strategy, and attempting to rally troops who were already tense and fearful. In many ways, the outcome seemed preordained, not because courage was lacking, but because organization and experience mattered far more than sheer numbers on that fateful day. As the British troops advanced through the fields towards Bladensburg, Ross took a moment to survey the landscape. He knew the Americans were preparing to make a stand, but he also understood their weaknesses. Inexperience, poor communication, and an over-reliance on hastily assembled militia meant that panic could spread like wildfire. And if panic spread, the path to Washington would lie open. Barney and his small contingent of sailors and Marines were preparing to contest that path. They dug in, set up defensive positions, and readied their cannons, knowing that the enemy was formidable but determined to make a stand. Their bravery would be remembered by those who survived, but in the face of Ross's well-trained veterans, even the most valiant efforts could not alter the course of what was to come. Meanwhile, across the city, the residents of Washington were largely unaware of the scale of the approaching threat. Rumors had filtered in of British movements, of their advance through Maryland, But the reality of a seasoned army bearing down on the capital was difficult to grasp. Merchants closed their shops, families hurriedly packed what belongings they could carry, and a nervous tension settled over the streets. Washington was about to witness a type of warfare it had never encountered, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Russ, ever observant, noted every movement, every hesitation among the Americans. He understood that morale was as much a weapon as muskets and cannons. A disciplined army could exploit fear, turn confusion into rout, and victory often lay in the mind as much as on the battlefield. He would not be denied. 40 miles behind enemy lines, he had no margin for error. Retreat was not an option, nor was failure. Every decision he made, every maneuver of his troops, had to be precise, because any misstep could lead to disaster. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was an almost cinematic quality to the preparation. British colors fluttered in the breeze, drums marked the rhythm of march, and soldiers polished weapons and tightened straps in synchrony. Across the fields, the Americans scrambled to form lines, shouting orders that were too often lost in the noise of confusion. History, in that moment, was balancing delicately on a knife's edge. The final hour before the clash were tense and electric. Ross's mind worked through possibilities, anticipating American movements, calculating the deployment of his troops, and preparing for every contingency. Barney and his men braced themselves, knowing that courage alone would not be enough to hold the British at bay, but determined to fight regardless. And somewhere in the city, civilians watched from windows and doorways, unaware that their home would soon be engulfed in fire and chaos, their fate resting on the actions of men they had never met. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the field of Bladensburg, the armies closed in. The moment of collision approached, a moment that would define the day, and yet, in the calm before the storm, neither side could know the full extent of what was to come. One general's experience and discipline would meet another's courage and determination, and the result would be a mixture of triumph, terror, and tragedy. And so, with both sides poised for battle, the story of the Bladensburg engagement truly begins. The clash of strategy against desperation, experience against bravery, and organization against chaos was about to unfold in a way that would reverberate far beyond the fields of Maryland. Major General Robert Ross was ready. Commodore Joshua Barney was ready. The city of Washington, unaware of the scale of the approaching storm, was about to witness a confrontation that will become one of America's most notorious military humiliations and one of Britain's most flawless, yet forgotten, victories. By late morning, the British Army was closing in on Bladensburg, a small town just outside Washington, D.C., and the tension in the air was almost tangible. The fields lay quiet, yet every tree, every fence line seemed poised to witness the coming storm. For Major General Robert Ross, the march had been methodical, deliberate, and precise. 40 miles behind enemy lines, with no reinforcements and a city waiting at the end of the road, every step mattered. The British columns moved like clockwork. Drums rolled, signaling forward motion. Colors fluttered proudly in the breeze, and officers moved among their men, checking formations, issuing last-minute orders. There was a quiet confidence among the troops, the kind that comes only from repeated exposure to the horrors of war and the knowledge that their general was not a man to be trifled with. Ross himself rode at the head of his column, calm, measured, and calculating. Every glance, every decision, reflected years of experience on battlefields across Europe. Ahead, the Americans were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. Bladensburg, a town chosen as the site of their defensive stand, was quickly becoming a place of desperate preparation. Militia units hurried to establish positions along the main road leading into the capital, while regular troops attempted to coordinate artillery placements and defensive lines. But confusion was everywhere. Orders overlapped, miscommunication was rife, and fear began to seep into even the most steadfast of men. The reality was unavoidable. The Americans were about to face a force trained, disciplined, and led by one of Europe's finest generals. At the forefront of the American defense was Commodore Joshua Barney, commanding a small but determined group of sailors and Marines. He knew that the task ahead was almost impossible, yet he refused to surrender hope. Cannons were positioned, earthworks hastily constructed, and men readied themselves to face the advancing British columns. Every heartbeat carried the weight of what was to come. Courage facing overwhelming odds, desperation confronting expertise, determination clashing with experience. Russ's strategy was simple in its brilliance. Exploit the enemy's inexperience, maintain cohesion among his own troops, and strike decisively. He had already identified weak points in the American line and knew where the pressure needed to be applied. Unlike the Americans, whose resolve wavered with each sight of the disciplined British columns, Ross's men were trained to follow orders without hesitation, to move as one, and to exploit openings with ruthless efficiency. As the two forces drew closer, the field between them became a stage for tension that could be cut with a knife. The Americans, nervous and untested, glanced nervously at one another. Would their militia hold the line? Could Barney's small contingent make a meaningful difference? Every minute that passed without engagement stretched nerves tighter. Across the field, the British soldiers remained composed, their experience visible in the way they adjusted muskets, checked ammunition, and kept their ranks perfectly aligned. Then, as the sun climbed higher, the inevitable collision occurred. A single cannon shot rang out, echoing across the fields like a harbinger of chaos. British troops advanced steadily, disciplined and unshaken, while American militia began to falter. The clash was sudden, brutal, and almost surreal in its intensity. For a brief moment, the disciplined formations of the British met the hastily organized American lines head-on. Muskets cracked, artillery thundered, and the fields of Bladensburg became a chaotic theater of combat. Barney's contingent fought valiantly, holding the British at bay long enough to give the militia some hope. His sailors and Marines moved with precision, their resolve shining even as panic spread among the American ranks. But for every act of bravery, there was a counteract of discipline from the British. Ross had anticipated resistance, but he had also counted on the fragility of an untested army. With tactical precision, his men began to exploit gaps, surround positions, and force American units into retreat. The term Bladensburg Races would later be coined in mockery, describing the sheer panic that overtook the American militia as they broke ranks and fled the field. Officers tried in vain to rally their troops, but fear proved stronger than training. In the face of relentless British pressure, entire units collapsed, leaving gaps that were immediately exploited. The sight was almost cinematic, lines crumbling, artillery abandoned, and the disciplined British soldiers advancing like a tide of inevitability. Russ, ever observant, moved among his columns, directing forces with quiet authority. His eye for detail allowed him to respond to every minor resistance, every act of heroism or hesitation, ensuring that his forces maintained cohesion. The Americans were disorganized, their defense fragmented, and Ross's experience turned that chaos into an opportunity. He would not suffer unnecessary losses, yet he would advance relentlessly. Every maneuver, every volley of musket fire, was calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimal cost. Despite the overwhelming odds, the courage of men like Barney shone through. Small pockets of resistance delayed the British advance, giving a brief glimmer of hope that the tide could be turned. Yet it was fleeting. The British discipline, their experience, and Ross's tactical genius proved too much. Slowly, inexorably, the American line collapsed. The road to Washington lay open. By mid-afternoon, the Battle of Bladensburg had reached its conclusion. For the Americans, it was a humiliating rout, a disaster that would echo through history as the day their capital was left virtually undefended. For the British, it was a triumph, almost flawless in execution, achieved without a single loss in the retreat that followed. Ross had done what many thought impossible. He had shattered an enemy twice his size, captured a key defensive position, and opened the path to the heart of the American capital. And yet, even in victory, there was an almost eerie calm. The smoke of musket fire still lingered in the air, bodies lay scattered across the field, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the distant rumble of advancing columns. The battle had been decisive, but it was only the beginning of what would soon become a story of fire, destruction, and one of the most perfect, yet strategically inconsequential victories in military history. Ross knew the next stage of his mission awaited him. Washington was vulnerable, exposed, and defenseless in many areas. The capture of the city and the symbolic destruction of its most important buildings was now within reach. But before he could strike, he paused briefly to observe the battlefield. He had achieved the impossible here at Bladensburg, but the real test, the moment that would define his legacy, was still to come. And so, with the Americans in disarray, their courage and determination tested but ultimately insufficient, the British army prepared to march into the capital. The stage was set for an event that would live in infamy, a day of fire and smoke that would mark the young American nation forever. The clash at Bladensburg had ended, but the story of audacity, strategy, and unexpected heroism was far from over. By late afternoon on August 24, 1814, the British Army, under the unwavering command of Major General Robert Ross, had completed the first part of a daring operation that few believed possible. The battle at Bladensburg was over. The American lines had crumbled, the militia had fled, and Commodore Joshua Barney's brave contingent had been forced to withdraw, leaving the path to the heart of Washington wide open. For Ross, the road ahead was clear, but the true challenge, entering the capital of a proud young nation, was about to unfold. The streets of Washington, D.C. lay eerily silent. The usual bustle of city life had evaporated, replaced by a tense stillness that was almost supernatural. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and families huddled in corners, uncertain whether the soldiers approaching were friend or foe. Smoke hung in the distance, the first sign of the destruction that was to come, yet no one fully comprehended the scale of what awaited them. Ross rode at the head of his column, observing his troops with calm scrutiny. His men moved with the same disciplined precision that had carried them through Bladensburg. There was no haste, no panic, only purpose. Every step was measured, every formation maintained, and every officer executed orders without hesitation. 40 miles behind enemy lines, operating deep in hostile territory, Ross's command remained flawless, a testament to his years of experience on Europe's most unforgiving battlefields. As the British approached the city's most symbolic structures, the Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. For the Americans, the collapse of Bladensburg had been more than a military defeat. It had been a psychological one. Panic, fear, and disbelief had swept through the ranks and into the streets. Few defenders remained, and those who did were scattered, exhausted, and uncertain of what to do next. The very heart of the nation was exposed, its government buildings vulnerable, its leadership absent. Ross's plan was ruthless in its clarity. Capture the city, strike a blow that would resonate symbolically, and achieve a victory that would demonstrate the precision, power, and discipline of his army. Yet, he understood that destruction had to be controlled. His objective was not wanton slaughter, but a demonstration of British capability, a tactical and psychological strike designed to send a message to a fledgling nation that had dared to challenge the most powerful empire in the world. The British entered Washington with calculated precision. Cannon fire was unnecessary, resistance was minimal. Streets that had once echoed with the sounds of daily life now rang with the disciplined march of soldiers, the clatter of boots against cobblestones, and the sharp commands of officers. The Capitol, the symbol of American democracy, stood vulnerable, its columns now facing men who had toppled empires in Europe and moved unopposed to the heart of the capital. Ross directed the occupation of key buildings, and soon the first fires were lit. Smoke rose in thick, dark columns, curling into the sky and visible for miles around. Flames licked at the wooden structures, consuming halls and chambers, the Capitol's library and offices succumbing to the inferno. The White House, the executive residence, was set ablaze shortly thereafter. The symbolic impact was profound. The seat of the American government, the home of its president, reduced to a smoldering ruin. Yet even amid destruction, Ross's discipline held. His men followed orders precisely, ensuring that the fires were controlled, that strategic buildings were struck while minimizing unnecessary loss of life. The operation was surgical, almost clinical, a display of military mastery rarely seen in such circumstances. The contrast between chaos and control, destruction, and precision highlighted why Ross's name, though largely forgotten today, was that of a brilliant tactician. Meanwhile, civilians watched from behind locked doors, their faces pale, eyes wide with horror. Families fled, merchants abandoned their shops, and the city's streets became corridors of panic and smoke. The psychological impact of Ross's campaign was immediate. The Americans had been humiliated, their capital desecrated, and their government left exposed. Yet, amid the horror, the stories of individual bravery persisted. Some citizens attempted to save possessions, some tried to extinguish flames, and others simply survived by fleeing. Human courage, small yet significant, contrasted sharply with the overwhelming force of the disciplined British army. Ross himself remained calm, a figure of composed authority amidst the chaos. He understood the irony that would later mark this campaign, a flawless tactical victory executed with precision and courage, yet one that would change nothing strategically. The British would eventually withdraw, leaving the city in flames of the war unresolved, a striking testament to the cruel paradox of history. For now, however, the task at hand was complete. Washington had been captured, its most important structures destroyed, and the British army had demonstrated its supremacy in the field. And yet, as smoke billowed over the city, as buildings burned and the streets lay empty and silent, Ross must have known that this victory, for all its perfection, would be fleeting in the annals of history. No one would march in triumph back to London with flags flying and victory parades planned. No decisive end to the war would follow this brilliant display of military skill. History would not remember Robert Ross in the same way it remembered Nelson or Wellington. The brilliance of his operation, his audacity, and the skill of his soldiers would fade, overshadowed by larger geopolitical events and the eventual stalemate of the war. By the evening, the fires raged unabated. Columns of smoke reached high into the sky, and the glow of the flames illuminated the destruction below. Soldiers maintained their positions, ensuring that key objectives were achieved, then prepared to withdraw in the precision that had marked every phase of the operation. The city, though scarred and smoldering, remained alive. The American spirit, though tested, was not entirely broken. This was the paradox of Ross's campaign. Perfect execution, total tactical dominance, yet almost immediate strategic irrelevance. A brilliant general had achieved the impossible, captured a capital, burned its most symbolic buildings, and yet the war would continue, and his name would slip quietly into obscurity. The fires of Washington were a spectacle of triumph, terror, and tragedy, a lesson in how history sometimes remembers battles, not the brilliance behind them. As night fell, the British prepared to withdraw, leaving the city scarred but unoccupied. Ross had accomplished his mission with extraordinary skill, and without a single loss during the retreat. It was a feat of military precision and audacity, yet it was also a moment destined to be almost forgotten, a perfect victory in every sense except one. It would change nothing. And so ends the capture of Washington. A city burned, a nation humiliated, yet the man behind it, Major General Robert Ross, would soon fade into the shadows of history. The fires had burned bright, but the story of his brilliance, his audacity, and the skill of his men was far from fully told. The battle for legacy, as much as for territory, was only beginning. As the smoke from Washington's burning capital and White House drifted lazily into the evening sky, Major General Robert Ross made a decision that would define not only his campaign but also the peculiar nature of victory in war. Unlike many commanders who might linger in a captured city to savor triumph or plunder spoils, Ross understood that his mission had a precise objective, and that objective had been achieved. There would be no recklessness, no unnecessary exposure to danger. His army would withdraw, intact, unscathed, a perfect force reserved for the battles yet to come. The march out of Washington was as orderly as the march in had been. 4,000 British veterans, disciplined and alert, moved with the precision of a clock, their formations maintained, their steps measured. Not a single soldier was lost. Not a single line was broken. Every officer executed orders with the calm authority that had carried them through Bladensburg and into the heart of the capital. The brilliance of Ross's command was on full display, an audacious strike 40 miles behind enemy lines, an unbroken advance into the enemy's heart, the burning of the nation's symbols, and now a flawless, unopposed withdrawal. For the Americans, the aftermath of the campaign was devastating, not merely for what had been lost, but for what it revealed. Panic and confusion had reigned, exposing weaknesses in leadership, training, and organization. Families returned to homes partially destroyed. Citizens witnessed the ruins of their fledgling government, and the few brave defenders who had tried to hold the line at Bladensburg were left to grapple with the knowledge that courage alone could not halt an experienced, disciplined enemy. Yet the irony of Ross's operation was striking, a perfect tactical victory, executed with extraordinary skill, that ultimately altered nothing in the broader conflict. Ross's tactical brilliance lay in his meticulous attention to detail. Every maneuver, every deployment, every engagement had been calculated to achieve maximum effect while minimizing risk. At Bladensburg, He had exploited the inexperience of the American militia, turning panic into a weapon. In Washington, he had struck symbolic targets, demonstrating the reach and capability of his army. And in the retreat, he ensured that not a single man, not a single unit, would fall victim to the enemy. It was a campaign executed with almost surgical precision, a military performance of the highest order. Yet history, as it so often does, proved indifferent to perfection. The War of 1812 continued, unresolved, its largest strategic questions unanswered. The capture and burning of Washington would become a moment of infamy, a humiliation etched into the American memory, but it would not determine the outcome of the conflict. Russ's victory, flawless in every measurable sense, left the broader war unchanged. The United States would continue to resist, to rebuild, and ultimately to emerge from the conflict without permanent territorial loss. The paradox was stark, a military genius's most brilliant operation, and yet, strategically, it was almost irrelevant. As the British columns moved away from the city, the reality of what they had accomplished became clear. They had demonstrated superiority, executed a campaign few could have imagined possible, and inflicted humiliation on a young nation. But they had done so without altering the larger course of the war. Russ had achieved the impossible, capturing a capital, destroying its symbols, and withdrawing unscathed. Yet when historians later recounted the events of the War of 1812, his name would appear only briefly, overshadowed by more famous battles, more celebrated generals, and the grand narratives of history. The contrast between the soldiers' experience and the perception of their actions highlights a cool irony of military history. Russ's men had marched into legend, at least for a moment, yet the broader story of the war rendered their brilliance nearly invisible. Victory, as they had achieved it, was ephemeral. Tactical mastery had no strategic weight. Triumph without lasting gain became a lesson in both the power and the limits of military skill. Despite this, the campaign was not without its human dimension. Among the soldiers, there was pride, satisfaction, and relief. They had followed an audacious plan into enemy territory, faced opposition, executed orders flawlessly, and returned without loss. For the veterans who had endured the hardships of Napoleonic Europe, this operation was another testament to the discipline and courage that defined them. Theirs was a quiet glory, observed by few and remembered by fewer. Yet even as Russ's army withdrew in perfection, the seeds of his own mortality had already been sown. Weeks later, in the siege of Baltimore, he would meet his end, felled by an American rifleman in a twist of fate that seemed almost literary in its irony. A general who had achieved the impossible, who had conducted a flawless campaign, would die before seeing his genius fully recognized. The narrative of his life, much like the burning of Washington, would be dramatic, striking, and yet largely forgotten. The story of the withdrawal from Washington is a lesson in both strategy and human psychology. Russ understood that commander's skill is measured not merely by audacity or destruction, but by control, foresight, and the ability to achieve objectives while preserving one's forces. His retreat was textbook perfect, a masterclass in tactical prudence. Yet, the larger story of the war rendered such brilliance almost invisible. Victory, in isolation, is meaningless if it does not serve a strategic purpose. Russ's campaign illustrates a cool arithmetic of history. Perfection in execution does not guarantee historical immortality. By nightfall, the British army had returned to safer ground, leaving behind a capital in flames and a legacy of humiliation for the Americans. The streets of Washington, once bustling and vibrant, were now scarred, the echo of muskets and the glow of fires lingering in memory and landscape alike. Russ's men had achieved everything they could, yet the ultimate prize, the end of the war, remained beyond their grasp. And so ends a chapter of the campaign that demonstrated audacity, precision, and tactical brilliance. Russ had won without loss, burned symbols of a nation, and executed a retreat that was as flawless as any maneuver in military history. Yet the strategic impact was negligible, and his name, like the smoke from Washington's buildings, would drift slowly into obscurity. The paradox was complete, a perfect military victory, remembered briefly, and then largely forgotten, a lesson in the limits of human skill and the caprice of historical memory. Weeks after the capture and burning of Washington, Major General Robert Russ found himself once again at the forefront of battle, this time in the city of Baltimore. The campaign had been a triumph of strategy, audacity, and flawless execution, yet history had already begun to obscure his name. Few remember the man who had marched 40 miles behind enemy lines, shattered American defenses at Bladensburg, and burned the symbols of a nation. Now, the final act of his extraordinary military career was about to unfold. Baltimore was heavily defended. The Americans had learned from the humiliation at Washington and had fortified the city's positions, constructing earthworks and defensive lines along the approaches. Russ, ever the disciplined strategist, approached with caution, his mind calculating every possible scenario. His men were battle-hardened, confident in his leadership, and ready to face a foe determined to prevent another disaster. Yet, despite his skill, the stakes were higher than ever. Unlike the capital, Baltimore would not be an easy target. On the morning of September 12, 1814, the British forces advanced against the American defenses, artillery booming and muskets ready. Russ, riding at the front, observed the terrain with the keen eye of a man who had seen thousands of battles, each experience shaping the way he moved and commanded. Every decision mattered. Every miscalculation could prove fatal. Yet fate, as it so often does, is unpredictable. As the British troops engaged the American defenders, a rifle shot rang out from an unseen position. Russ, commanding and directing his forces at the very forefront, was struck down almost instantly. The precision of the attack, delivered by an unknown American rifleman, ended the life of a general whose brilliance had reshaped a campaign and who had executed one of the most audacious military operations of his era. Ross's death was sudden, unexpected, and tragic, a stark reminder that even the most brilliant commanders are not immune to the fortunes of war. The loss of Ross at Baltimore cast a shadow over the British operations. His men mourned him quietly, but their discipline held. The campaign continued, yet the figure who had orchestrated the capture of Washington, the man whose tactics had been impeccable, was gone. It is here, perhaps, that the paradox of Ross's legacy becomes most poignant. A general capable of extraordinary achievement, commanding brilliant operations, and demonstrating tactical genius would die before the broader significance of his work could be fully recognized. Why has history been so unkind to Robert Russ? Why is he not remembered alongside Wellington or Nelson, whose names are celebrated for victories that reshaped Europe? The answer lies in the cool arithmetic of history. Russ's accomplishments, though tactically perfect, achieved little strategic change. The burning of Washington shocked a young nation, yet it did not end the war. Baltimore held, the conflict continued, and ultimately the Treaty of Ghent restored the status quo ante bellum. Victory in isolation, no matter how brilliant, does not guarantee enduring fame. Yet the story of Ross is a testament to skill, courage, and audacity. His capture of Washington remains a textbook example of operational brilliance, striking deep into enemy territory, exploiting weaknesses, maintaining perfect discipline, and withdrawing without loss. It is a campaign that military historians still study, though often as a footnote, overshadowed by more famous figures and battles. Ross's legacy, though obscured, endures in the lessons he left behind, lessons about preparation, timing, and the precise execution of strategy. The irony of his life is striking. He had achieved what few generals could, a perfect campaign, tactical brilliance, and the humiliation of an enemy's capital. And yet, in death, he became almost invisible in the grand narrative of history. His triumphs were overshadowed, not by failure, but by circumstance, timing, and the wider sweep of global events. The brilliance of an operation does not always secure a place in collective memory. Ross's story challenges our assumptions about heroism, recognition, and the way history chooses to remember or forget its figures. For those who study the War of 1812, the Battle of Bladensburg, and the burning of Washington, Ross's presence looms large, even if his name has faded. The audacity of marching 40 miles behind enemy lines, the meticulous exploitation of enemy weakness, and the flawless withdrawal all demonstrate a general operating at the height of his craft. And yet, the world moved on, leaving his story as a cautionary tale about the fleeting nature of glory and the arbitrary hand of historical memory. Perhaps what makes Ross's story so compelling is not the fame he never achieved, but the perfection he attained in the face of overwhelming odds. 4,000 men, marching deep into hostile territory, capturing a capital, destroying its symbols, and withdrawing without a single loss. These are feats that challenge belief. And yet, The larger narrative of war and politics rendered these feats almost irrelevant, a lesson in how tactical brilliance and human courage can be overshadowed by circumstance. Russ's death, sudden and almost anonymous, marks a final act in a drama of audacity and precision. Yet the story does not end there. For those willing to look beyond the familiar names and celebrated victories, the campaign at Washington, the march to Bladensburg, and the perfect operation executed by Robert Russ remain among the most extraordinary examples of military skill in history. His name may not be chanted in parades or inscribed in monuments, but his actions continue to echo in the study of strategy, leadership, and the sometimes cruel arbiters of memory. And so, as Baltimore defended itself, as the war dragged on, and as the smoke from Washington slowly cleared, the story of Robert Russ became a quiet legend. A man who achieved the impossible, who commanded with brilliance, and who executed a perfect campaign, yet whose name would not endure in the popular imagination. The lessons of his life and death, however, remain vital. Courage, skill, and audacity matter, but so too does timing, circumstance, and the unpredictable nature of history itself. Russ's brilliance, his tactical perfection, and the audacity of his campaign may be forgotten by many, but they are no less remarkable for that. The story of his life, his victories, and his death challenges us to reconsider the way we remember history, the heroes we choose to celebrate, and the narratives we allow to fade into obscurity. In the ashes of Washington, in the chaos of Bladensburg, and in the fields before Baltimore, the legacy of Robert Russ endures, silent, almost invisible, yet indelibly brilliant.